The night of April 12, 1945, on the southern ridges of Okinawa, rain fell in sheets, turning the red clay into glue that sucked at boots and made every step a struggle. Private First Class James Hendricks crouched in a hastily dug foxhole, water pooling around his knees, his hands wrapped around an M1 carbine that felt slick with moisture and fear. Around him, the darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars, just an impenetrable blackness that made it impossible to see beyond the edge of his own hole. Somewhere out there, he knew, Japanese soldiers were moving through the night, silent as shadows, closing in on the American lines. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He had been on Okinawa for 11 days now, and every night had been the same. The waiting, the listening, the knowledge that when the Japanese came, they would come in darkness, and by the time you saw them, it would be too late. 3 nights ago, the man in the foxhole next to his had been found at dawn with his throat cut, his rifle still leaning against the wall of dirt, unfired. 2 nights ago, an entire squad position had been overrun in minutes, the survivors describing figures that appeared out of nowhere, so close they could smell them before they could see them. This was the Japanese way of war in the Pacific. They owned the night. But tonight, something was different. 50 yards behind Hendricks, in a reinforced position near the command post, Corporal Chen sat with a weapon that looked like something out of a science fiction magazine. The M1 carbine in his hands had been modified, its receiver topped with a strange telescope and a large infrared lamp mounted beneath the stock, connected by a thick cable to a heavy battery pack strapped to his back. The whole contraption weighed nearly 30 pounds and made him feel like he was carrying a small generator into combat. They called it the Sniperscope, though the men who had to haul it around had other names for it, most of them unprintable. Chen had been trained on the weapon for exactly 4 days before being shipped to Okinawa. The briefing had been short and classified. He was told that the device could see in complete darkness using invisible infrared light, that it had an effective range of about 70 yards, and that he was absolutely forbidden from discussing it with anyone outside his immediate unit. The technology was secret. Top secret. If the Japanese captured one, if they learned how it worked, the advantage would be lost. So Chen sat in his hole, rain streaming down his face, staring through a scope that showed him nothing but a grainy green emptiness, and wondered if the thing would even work when it mattered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 1900 hours, the rain intensified. Chen wiped the lens of his scope for the 100th time and peered into the darkness. The infrared lamp beneath his carbine threw out a cone of invisible light that his scope could detect and amplify, turning the pitch-black night into a ghostly green landscape of shapes and shadows. But the rain scattered the infrared beam, reducing visibility to maybe 40 yards. He could see the outline of rocks, the twisted remains of a burned-out tree, the lip of a shell crater. But nothing moved. Not yet. In the American lines, the word had gone out to hold fire unless absolutely necessary. The defenders knew the Japanese preferred to attack at night, and they knew the pattern. First would come probing attacks, small groups feeling for weak points in the line. Then, if they found one, a larger force would pour through, trying to reach the artillery positions or the supply dumps before dawn. The strategy had worked for them throughout the Pacific campaign. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, Japanese night infiltrators had caused chaos and terror, slipping through American lines to kill sentries, destroy equipment, and spread panic. The darkness was their weapon, and for years the Americans had no answer to it. But that was about to change. At 2100 hours, Chen saw the first movement through his scope. A figure, low to the ground, moving between 2 boulders about 60 yards out. Then another, and another. He counted 5 men, all armed, all moving with the practiced stealth of soldiers who had done this many times before. They were heading directly toward Hendricks' position. Chen reached for the radio handset clipped to his webbing and spoke in a whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain. Contact. 60 yards, 5 enemy, moving toward Sector 3. The response came back immediately. Hold. Observe. Do not fire until they breach 50 yards. Chen watched through his scope as the Japanese soldiers crept closer. They moved in single file, using the terrain for cover, stopping every few yards to listen and watch. One of them carried what looked like a satchel charge. Another had a sword strapped to his back. These were not regular infantry. These were infiltrators, specialists trained for night operations, men who volunteered for missions that had almost no chance of survival. Their job was to break the American line, to cause enough confusion and damage that a larger force could exploit the gap, and they were very good at it. Hendricks, in his foxhole, heard nothing, saw nothing. The rain covered any sound of movement, and the darkness was so complete he could barely see his own hands. He checked his carbine again, making sure a round was chambered, and waited. His heart hammered in his chest. Every rustle of vegetation, every drip of water, could be the enemy, or it could be nothing. There was no way to know. This was the terror of night combat in the Pacific. The enemy could be 3 feet away, and you wouldn't know it until the bayonet went in. Chen watched the Japanese soldiers advance to 55 yards. 50 yards. 45. They were spread out now, each man taking a different approach route, converging on the American foxholes from multiple angles. Standard infiltration tactics. Chen centered his crosshairs on the lead man, a figure carrying a rifle with a fixed bayonet, moving in a low crouch toward Hendricks' position. The green image in his scope was clear enough to see the outline of the soldier's helmet, the shape of his pack. Chen took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The carbine kicked against his shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed across the hillside. Through his scope, Chen saw the lead Japanese soldier drop instantly, falling face first into the mud. The other 4 froze, confused, looking around frantically. They had not expected fire from that direction. They had not seen a muzzle flash. As far as they knew, they were still invisible in the darkness. Chen worked the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again. The second man went down, then the third. The remaining 2 Japanese soldiers broke and ran, sprinting back toward their own lines. Chen tracked one of them in his scope and fired a third time. The man stumbled and fell. The last soldier disappeared into the darkness. In his foxhole, Hendricks heard the shots and saw nothing. He gripped his carbine tighter, scanning the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. Then Chen's voice came over the radio. 4 down, 1 got away, all clear. Hendricks exhaled slowly, his hands shaking. He had not fired a shot, he had not seen a thing, but someone, somewhere in the American lines, had just stopped a Japanese infiltration team in complete darkness. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. Over the next 3 hours, Chen engaged 6 more times. Each time, his scope revealed Japanese soldiers, moving through the darkness, trying to penetrate the American lines. Each time, he fired before they got close enough to be a threat. By the time dawn broke over Okinawa, 17 Japanese soldiers lay dead in no man's land, all of them killed by a weapon they never saw, using a technology they did not know existed. The American casualties for that sector that night were 0. When the sun finally rose, casting grey light over the muddy battlefield, a patrol went out to examine the bodies. What they found told a story. Every Japanese soldier had been shot from a distance of between 40 and 70 yards, most of them with a single round. There were no signs of close-quarter combat, no bayonet wounds, no grenade fragments, just clean rifle shots, fired with precision in pitch darkness. The patrol leader, a lieutenant who had fought on Guadalcanal and Saipan, stood looking at the bodies and shook his head slowly. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "The Japanese don't own the night anymore." Word of what happened that night spread through the American lines like wildfire. Soldiers who had spent months dreading nightfall, who had lost friends to infiltrators and banzai charges in the darkness, suddenly began to feel something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. The weapon that had done this, whatever it was, had turned the tables. For the first time in the Pacific War, American soldiers could see in the dark, and the Japanese had no idea. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, why a handful of soldiers with a strange-looking carbine could change the psychology of an entire campaign, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand the Japanese mastery of night combat and the years of terror it inflicted on American troops from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. You have to understand why darkness had become the Japanese army's most effective weapon, and why the Americans had been, until this moment, powerless to counter it. The roots of Japanese night-fighting doctrine went back decades to the wars in China and Manchuria in the 1930s. Japanese military theorists had studied the problem of how a numerically inferior force could defeat a larger, better-equipped enemy. The answer they developed was to attack when and where the enemy was weakest, and the enemy was always weakest at night. Human beings are diurnal creatures. We are not built to fight in darkness. Our eyes fail us. Our hearing becomes unreliable. Fear multiplies in the absence of visual information. A soldier who can stand firm in daylight will break and run when attacked by an invisible enemy in pitch blackness. The Japanese army made night operations a core part of their training. Soldiers practiced moving silently in darkness, navigating by feel and memory, communicating with hand signals that could be felt rather than seen. They learned to approach enemy positions on their stomachs, crawling for hours to cover ground that could be walked in minutes. They studied how to exploit moonless nights, heavy rain, and fog. They developed infiltration techniques that could put a man inside an enemy perimeter without triggering a single alert. By the time the Pacific War began in 1941, Japanese night tactics were the most advanced in the world. American soldiers encountered this reality almost immediately. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marines holding Henderson Field faced nightly infiltration attempts by Japanese troops who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Sentries would be found dead at their posts, throats cut, without anyone nearby hearing a sound. Japanese soldiers would crawl through American lines, cut telephone wires, throw grenades into command posts, and vanish before reinforcements could respond. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers stopped sleeping. They fired at shadows. They became so jumpy that they sometimes shot at each other in the darkness, mistaking friendly troops for infiltrators. The pattern repeated itself throughout the Pacific campaign. On Tarawa, Japanese defenders used the coral rubble and palm logs to approach Marine positions under cover of darkness, getting close enough to throw satchel charges into pillboxes. On Saipan, infiltrators would slip through the lines carrying nothing but grenades and knives, targeting officers and radio operators, trying to disrupt command and control. On Peleliu, Japanese troops used the complex cave systems to appear behind American lines after dark, attacking supply dumps and artillery positions before disappearing back into the tunnels. The Americans tried everything to counter these tactics. They set up tripwires and booby traps. They used listening posts and roving patrols. They called in artillery barrages on suspected infiltration routes. Nothing worked consistently. The Japanese were simply too good at moving in darkness, and the Americans had no way to see them until it was too late. So the Americans adapted in the only way they could. They made the nights shorter. Artillery would fire illumination rounds all night long, trying to keep the battlefield lit. Machine gunners would sweep their sectors with grazing fire at irregular intervals, hoping to catch infiltrators in the open. Entire units would stay awake through the night, every man on alert, exhausted but too frightened to sleep. It was a brutal, inefficient way to fight, and it took a terrible toll on the troops. By 1944, American military planners knew they needed a better solution. Night combat was not going to go away. As the war moved closer to the Japanese home islands, resistance was intensifying, and Japanese troops were becoming more willing to die in suicidal attacks if it meant killing Americans. The night infiltration tactics that had been effective on Guadalcanal were even more deadly on Saipan and Peleliu, where Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions and knew the terrain intimately. If the United States was going to invade Okinawa and eventually Japan itself, something had to change. The Americans needed to see in the dark. The solution came from an unlikely source, not from the infantry or the Marines or the tactical theorists at the War College, but from the engineers. The United States Army Corps of Engineers had been experimenting with infrared technology since the late 1930s, exploring its potential uses for signaling, navigation, and reconnaissance. Infrared light is invisible to the human eye but can be detected by specially designed electronic sensors. If you could build a device that emitted infrared light and a scope that could detect it, you could illuminate a target without the enemy seeing the light source. It was, in theory, the perfect solution to the night fighting problem. The first practical prototype was developed in late 1943 at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. It consisted of an electronic telescope that could detect infrared light, paired with a sealed beam lamp similar to an automobile headlight, fitted with an infrared filter. The system was powered by a heavy lead-acid battery carried in a canvas backpack. When mounted on an M1 carbine, the entire setup weighed about 21 pounds, more than twice the weight of a standard rifle. It was bulky, awkward, and fragile. But it worked. A soldier using the device could see targets in complete darkness at ranges up to 100 yards, while the targets remained completely unaware they were being illuminated. The Army designated the prototype as the T-120 scope and began testing it under field conditions. The results were promising enough that in February 1944, the Ordnance Department recommended limited procurement of what they now called the carbine caliber .30 T3 Sniperscope. Contracts were awarded to Inland Manufacturing, a division of General Motors, and Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The production target was modest. Just a few thousand units, enough to equip selected units in the Pacific Theater. This was not meant to be a weapon for every soldier. It was a specialized tool for a specific mission, stopping Japanese night infiltrators. The T3 carbine itself was a modified M1 carbine with an integral receiver mount to accommodate the infrared sight. The stock was redesigned with a flat platform on the bottom to attach the infrared lamp assembly. A pistol grip and trigger switch were added to control the lamp. The whole system required careful calibration. The infrared beam had to be aligned precisely with the scope's line of sight, and the battery had to maintain consistent voltage, or the image would fade. Soldiers selected to use the weapon received special training on maintenance and operation. They were told, repeatedly, that the system was classified secret, and that under no circumstances were they to discuss it or allow it to be photographed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The sun rose over Okinawa on June 23, 1945, casting long shadows over a landscape transformed by 3 months of continuous combat. The island that had been green and lush in April was now a wasteland of shell craters, burned trees, and collapsed fortifications. The smell of death hung in the air, mixing with the salt breeze from the ocean. American soldiers moved slowly through the ruins, exhausted beyond measure, checking caves and bunkers for any remaining Japanese defenders. The battle was officially over. The last organized resistance had been crushed the day before, but everyone knew that isolated pockets of Japanese troops would continue fighting for weeks or months, unable to accept that the war on Okinawa had ended. For the men who had operated the T3 carbines during the campaign, the end of the battle brought a mixture of relief and anticlimax. The scopes that had seemed so revolutionary in April now felt like just another piece of equipment, covered in mud and corrosion, barely functional after months of hard use. The battery packs were dead or dying. The infrared lamps were cracked or misaligned. Many of the scopes had been damaged by artillery concussion or simple wear and tear. The men who had relied on them for survival now looked at them with the weary pragmatism of soldiers who had learned that all equipment eventually fails, and that staying alive depends more on luck and determination than on any piece of technology. But the impact of what they had accomplished was beginning to be understood by the command structure. Reports filtered back to headquarters, detailing the effectiveness of the infrared scopes against night infiltration. The statistics were analyzed and compared to previous campaigns. The conclusions were undeniable. In sectors where T3 carbines had been deployed, Japanese night infiltration had been significantly less successful than on previous islands. American casualties from nighttime attacks were lower. Morale among defenders was higher. The weapon had worked, not spectacularly, not perfectly, but consistently and reliably enough to make a measurable difference. Word of the system's success reached Washington and the Pentagon. Military planners who had been skeptical about the infrared program now became advocates. Recommendations were made to expand production, to improve the technology, to make night vision a standard capability for all infantry units. But by June 1945, the context had changed. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered in May. And in the Pacific, events were moving toward a conclusion that no one in April could have predicted. The atomic bomb was being prepared for use against Japan. Plans for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which would have required massive deployment of night vision equipment, were being overtaken by events that would make that invasion unnecessary. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroyed the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb devastated Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The Pacific War was over. The industrial machine that had been gearing up to produce thousands of improved infrared scopes suddenly had no customer. Contracts were cancelled. Production lines were shut down. The improved M3 carbine system that was supposed to replace the T3 was put into limited production but never deployed in combat during World War II. The technology that had proven itself on Okinawa was, for the moment, overtaken by larger historical forces. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the classified nature of the infrared scope program created complications. The Army wanted to study the system, to learn from the Okinawa experience, to develop improved versions for future conflicts. But the technology was still officially secret. The T3 carbines could not be discussed in public reports or shown in photographs. Soldiers who had used them were told not to mention them in interviews or memoirs. The weapons themselves were recalled from the field, inventoried, and in most cases, destroyed. The battery packs were disposed of. The scopes were disassembled. By 1946, fewer than 50 complete T3 carbine systems remained in existence, stored in secure facilities or retained by museums for historical purposes. The secrecy created a strange gap in the historical record. The T3 carbine had played a significant role in the Battle of Okinawa, yet it barely appeared in the official histories of the campaign. Veterans who had used the system found that their experiences were difficult to talk about because the weapon they had relied on was classified. Some wrote letters to the Army asking for permission to discuss the infrared scopes in memoirs or interviews. The responses were uniformly negative. The technology remained classified throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, even though by that time, improved versions were being used in Korea, and the basic principles of infrared detection were well understood by scientists worldwide. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, brought the infrared carbine back into service, but in an improved form. The M3 carbine with the 20,000-volt infrared scope had nearly double the effective range of the World War II system, could operate longer on its batteries, and was somewhat more reliable in field conditions. But the fundamental concept remained the same. A carbine-mounted infrared lamp illuminated targets that were detected by an electronic scope, allowing soldiers to see in complete darkness. The lessons learned on Okinawa were applied in Korea, where the weapon proved effective in defensive positions against Chinese and North Korean infiltration tactics. But the Korean War also revealed the limitations that would eventually make the active infrared system obsolete. The system required a large infrared lamp that consumed substantial power. The lamp could be detected by enemy forces if they had their own infrared detection equipment, which the Chinese forces were beginning to acquire by the early 1950s. The system was still heavy and cumbersome, requiring a 2- or 3-man team to operate effectively in combat, and it was still dependent on weather conditions, losing effectiveness in rain or fog. These limitations led to research into passive night vision systems that amplified existing light rather than projecting infrared beams, and by the Vietnam War, Such systems were beginning to replace the older active infrared scopes. The veterans of Okinawa, who had used the T3 carbine, watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, they were proud to have been part of the first generation of soldiers to use night vision in combat. They understood that the clumsy system they had carried through the mud of Okinawa had been the foundation for more advanced technology. On the other hand, they sometimes felt forgotten, their contribution erased by classification and overshadowed by the atomic bombs and the dramatic end of the war. The T3 carbine was never famous. It never appeared on recruiting posters or in Hollywood films. It remained a footnote, known mainly to military historians and weapons collectors. David Chen returned to civilian life in late 1945. He settled in California, got married, found work as a machinist. He did not talk about the war much, and when he did, he focused on the common experiences, the food, the boredom, the camaraderie. He never mentioned the T3 carbine. The weapon was still classified, and even if it had not been, he was not sure how to explain it. How do you describe to people who had never been in combat what it felt like to see in the dark? How do you convey the weight of being the man with the scope, knowing that other soldiers were depending on you to see what they could not see? It was easier to stay silent, to keep those memories private. In the 1960s, when the Army finally declassified much of the information about the World War II infrared program, Chen received a letter from a military historian asking if he would be willing to be interviewed about his experiences with the T3 carbine on Okinawa. He declined. By then, he was in his 40s, with children and a mortgage, and a life that had moved far beyond the war. The memories of those nights on Okinawa were still vivid, but they belonged to a different person, a younger man who had done things that the older Chen preferred not to revisit. The historian was disappointed but understanding. He had interviewed other veterans of the infrared program and had heard similar responses. The men who had used the scopes did not want to be celebrated or remembered. They just wanted to move on. But not all veterans felt that way. Some, as they grew older, began to realize that their experiences with the T3 carbine were historically significant. They had been part of a technological revolution in warfare, witnesses to a moment when the balance of night combat permanently shifted. In the 1970s and 80s, a few veterans began writing memoirs and giving interviews about their time with the infrared scopes. Their accounts provided invaluable first-hand detail about how the system worked in combat, what its limitations were, and how it affected both American and Japanese tactics. These memoirs, published in small circulation military history journals or self-published as limited edition books, became the primary source material for historians trying to understand the role of early night vision technology in World War II. One of these veterans was Sergeant Frank Morrison, who had operated a T3 carbine on Okinawa in the same general area as David Chen, though the two men never met during the war. Morrison's account, published in 1982, described in vivid detail what it was like to use the infrared scope in combat. He wrote about the physical burden of carrying the heavy battery pack for hours, the eye strain from staring through the scope, the constant fear that the system would fail at the critical moment. But he also wrote about the satisfaction of protecting his fellow soldiers, of seeing the enemy before they could strike, of turning the tables on infiltrators who thought they were invisible. Morrison's account included one particularly revealing anecdote. On the night of May 3, 1945, he was positioned on a hillside overlooking a valley that Japanese troops were known to use as an infiltration route. It was raining heavily, reducing his infrared scope's effective range to about 40 yards. Around midnight, he detected movement in the valley. Through his scope, he could see 4 figures, moving in single file, hunched against the rain, carrying what looked like satchel charges. They were heading directly toward an American artillery position, about 200 yards behind Morrison's location. Morrison called in the contact over the radio and was told to engage if the infiltrators came within range. He watched them approach, counting down the distance. 50 yards, 45, 40. At 38 yards, he opened fire. The first man dropped. The others scattered, but Morrison could still see them through his scope, green figures against the darker background. He fired 4 more rounds, hitting at least 2 more targets. The survivors fled back into the darkness. When a patrol went out at dawn to check the area, they found 3 dead Japanese soldiers with satchel charges that would have been more than enough to destroy several artillery pieces and kill a dozen men. Morrison's intervention, made possible by the infrared scope, had prevented a disaster. But Morrison also wrote honestly about the limitations and failures of the system. There were nights when the rain was so heavy that the scope was useless, when he could see nothing but a blur of water droplets reflecting infrared light. There were times when the battery died in the middle of an engagement, leaving him blind and vulnerable. There were false alarms, when he fired at shapes that turned out to be bushes or animals rather than enemy soldiers. And there were nights when Japanese infiltrators got through despite the infrared coverage, when the gaps in the defensive network or the limitations of the 70-yard range allowed skilled soldiers to penetrate the American lines undetected. The T3 carbine was not a silver bullet. It did not make night infiltration impossible, and it did not eliminate Japanese night fighting capabilities. What it did was reduce those capabilities significantly, making infiltration more dangerous and less effective than it had been on previous islands. That incremental improvement saved lives, but it did not change the fundamental nature of the Okinawa campaign, which remained a brutal, grinding battle that cost both sides dearly. The infrared scope was a tool, and like all tools, it was only as good as the men who used it and the tactical situations in which it was employed. The Japanese perspective on the infrared scopes is harder to document because so few Japanese soldiers who encountered the system survived to describe the experience. The Imperial Japanese Army's records from Okinawa were mostly destroyed during the battle or in the chaos of the surrender. The few accounts that exist come from post-war interrogations of prisoners and from memoirs written decades later by Japanese veterans. These sources suggest that most Japanese soldiers never understood what they were facing. They knew that American night defensive fire had become more accurate and deadly on Okinawa, but they attributed this to improved tactics or better artillery coordination rather than to any new technology. Some Japanese officers, however, did recognize that something had changed. Lieutenant Ichiro Sato, who survived the battle and was captured in late June, told interrogators that he had noticed American troops in certain sectors seemed to possess an uncanny ability to detect infiltrators at distances that should have been impossible in darkness. He speculated that the Americans might be using some kind of listening device or sound detection equipment. When asked if he had ever seen any unusual weapons or optical equipment, he said no. The infrared lamp and scope would have been nearly invisible in darkness to someone who did not know what to look for, and by the time Japanese soldiers were close enough to see the equipment clearly, they were usually already under fire. The secrecy surrounding the T3 carbine extended beyond the immediate post-war period. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, the basic detail of the World War II infrared program remained classified. This was partly because improved versions of the system were still in use in Korea and later in Vietnam, and the military did not want to reveal operational capabilities to potential enemies. But it was also because the early infrared technology had been developed at considerable expense, and the Army wanted to protect its investment in that research. Only gradually, as passive night vision systems replaced the active infrared scopes, and the technology became obsolete, did the classification restrictions relax. By the 1970s, enough information had been declassified that historians could begin piecing together the full story of the T3 carbine and its use on Okinawa. Weapons collectors began seeking out the rare surviving examples, paying substantial sums for complete systems with their scopes, battery packs, and accessories. Museums acquired specimens for their World War II collections. Technical manuals and training documents were obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. Slowly, the T3 carbine emerged from the shadows of classification into the light of historical scrutiny. What that scrutiny revealed was a weapon system that was far ahead of its time in concept, but constrained by the technological limitations of the 1940s. The active infrared principle was sound, and the execution was as good as could be expected given the available components and manufacturing techniques. But the system was limited by battery technology that could not provide enough power in a compact package, by vacuum tube electronics that were fragile and power-hungry, by optics that were not optimized for infrared wavelengths. These limitations meant that the T3 carbine, while revolutionary, was also transitional. It proved that night vision was possible, but it also showed that much better systems would be needed before night vision could become a standard infantry capability. The evolution of night vision technology after World War II followed a predictable path. Each generation of equipment was lighter, more reliable, and more capable than the one before. The M3 carbine system used in Korea was better than the T3. The Starlight scopes used in Vietnam were better than the M3. The second-generation night vision devices of the 1970s and 80s were better still. And the third-generation passive night vision goggles used by modern militaries represent a level of capability that would have seemed like science fiction to the soldiers who carried the T3 carbines on Okinawa. Today's infantrymen can see clearly in conditions of near-total darkness at ranges of hundreds of yards, using equipment that weighs a few pounds, and can operate for many hours on small batteries. But all of that technology, all of those improvements, trace their lineage back to the T3 carbine and the men who used it on Okinawa in 1945. They were the first. They proved it could be done. They showed that night vision was not just a laboratory curiosity, but a practical military capability that could save lives and change the balance of combat. Every soldier who has used night vision equipment since then, from Korea to Iraq to Afghanistan, owes a debt to those first operators who struggled with heavy battery packs and grainy green scopes and equipment that barely worked half the time. They were pioneers, though they would have laughed at the term. They were just trying to stay alive. The broader significance of the T3 carbine lies not in its technical specifications or its battlefield performance, impressive as those were, but in what it represented about the American approach to warfare. The United States in World War II was not just fighting with more men and more equipment than its enemies. It was fighting with a different mindset, one that embraced technological innovation and was willing to experiment with unconventional solutions to tactical problems. The infrared scope program was expensive, risky, and unproven. It could easily have been cancelled or delayed by bureaucratic caution or by competing priorities, but it was pushed forward, refined, tested, and deployed, all in the space of about 18 months from initial design to combat use. This willingness to take risks on new technology gave the United States a significant advantage throughout the war. Radar, sonar, the proximity fuse, the atomic bomb, and dozens of less famous innovations all flowed from a research and development infrastructure that was unmatched by any other nation. Japan, by contrast, had talented engineers and scientists, but lacked the industrial base and the organizational flexibility to translate their ideas into mass-produced equipment. The result was that by 1945, the technology gap between American and Japanese forces was enormous. The T3 carbine was just one example among many, but it was a particularly clear demonstration of how that technology gap translated into tactical advantage on the battlefield. For the Japanese soldiers who faced the infrared scopes on Okinawa, the experience was profoundly demoralizing, not just because they were being killed by an invisible enemy, but because it forced them to confront a truth they had been avoiding. Japan was losing the war not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because it could not compete with American industrial and technological power. The night vision system was a microcosm of that larger reality. Even if Japanese engineers had known exactly how the infrared scopes worked, even if they had been given complete blueprints and specifications, they could not have produced them in meaningful numbers. The manufacturing capacity, the supply chains, the electrical components, all of it was beyond Japan's reach by 1945. This realization, repeated across dozens of different technologies and weapon systems, contributed to the sense of hopelessness that pervaded the Japanese military in the final year of the war. They were fighting an enemy who could see in the dark, who had ships that could detect submarines underwater, who had planes that could fly at night with precision, who had weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single bomb. Courage and determination could not overcome such advantages. The only question was how long the war would last, and how many would die before the inevitable end came. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 overshadowed everything else that happened in the Pacific Campaign. The T3 carbine, which had seemed so important on Okinawa, was suddenly irrelevant in the face of nuclear weapons. The planned invasion of Japan, which would have required thousands of improved infrared scopes and would have tested the technology on a massive scale, never happened. The story of the T3 carbine ended not with a culminating triumph, but with a whimper. Contracts cancelled and equipment warehoused. It was an anticlimactic conclusion to what had been a remarkable innovation. But in the decades since the war, as historians have studied the Okinawa campaign in detail, and as veterans have shared their experiences, the significance of the T3 carbine has been re-evaluated. It is now recognized as a pivotal moment in military technology, the first successful combat deployment of night vision equipment. The lessons learned on Okinawa informed the development of all subsequent night vision systems. The tactical doctrine developed for using the scopes became the foundation for modern night fighting techniques. The T3 carbine may have been forgotten by the general public, but among military historians and technology specialists, it holds an honored place as a genuine innovation that changed warfare forever. David Chen, the corporal who operated one of those scopes on Okinawa, never sought recognition for his service. He died in 1993, still reluctant to talk about the war. But in his final years, his grandson convinced him to record some of his memories on tape. Those recordings, now preserved in a family archive, include a brief description of the infrared carbine and what it was like to use it in combat. Chen's voice on the tape is quiet, matter of fact, describing the technical details without drama or embellishment. But at the end, he says something that captures the essence of what the T3 carbine meant to the men who carried it. "We were scared all the time on Okinawa," he says. "Every night, we knew the Japanese were out there, moving in the dark, trying to kill us. And every night, we had to sit in our holes and wait, not knowing if we would see the morning. But with that scope, I could see them. I could see them coming. And as long as I could see them, I had a chance. That scope gave me a chance. That's all any of us wanted. Just a chance. That, in the end, is the story of the T3 carbine. Not a story of technological triumph or military glory, but a story of men trying to survive a war using whatever tools they were given. The infrared scope was an imperfect tool, limited and problematic, but it was better than nothing. It gave soldiers like Chen a fighting chance against an enemy who had mastered darkness. It took away the Japanese advantage in night combat and leveled the playing field, and in doing so, it saved lives. How many lives is impossible to say with certainty. Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands, if you count not just the direct engagements, but the deterrent effect of making Japanese infiltration tactics less viable. The Japanese soldiers who died in the darkness of Okinawa, killed by weapons they could not see and technology they did not understand, have their own story. They were brave men, fighting for their country with a determination that demanded respect even from their enemies. They followed orders, executed tactics that had been successful throughout the war, and died trying to do their duty. The fact that those tactics no longer worked as well, that the darkness that had protected them was no longer absolute, was not their failure. It was the result of forces larger than any individual soldier could control. The war they were fighting had been decided by factors that had nothing to do with courage or skill in combat. The lesson of the T3 carbine, if there is one, is about the nature of military advantage and how technology reshapes the battlefield. For thousands of years, night was an obstacle to combat, a natural limit on when and how armies could fight. The development of practical night vision technology removed that limit, turning night into just another operating environment. This was a fundamental change, one whose full implications took decades to manifest. Modern military forces operate around the clock, with no distinction between day and night missions. Special operations forces, in particular, have embraced night operations as a core capability, using night vision equipment to attack when the enemy is least prepared. All of this can be traced back, in part, to those first T3 carbines on Okinawa. They proved the concept. They showed that technology could extend human capabilities beyond their natural limits. They demonstrated that darkness, which had seemed like an immutable constraint on warfare, was actually just another problem waiting for a technological solution. That realization opened the door to innovations that would have seemed like fantasy to soldiers in earlier eras. And it all began with a bulky, temperamental carbine with a heavy battery pack and a 70-yard range, operated by exhausted soldiers in the mud and rain of Okinawa. The T3 carbine is gone now, at least as a functioning weapon system. The few that survive are museum pieces, carefully preserved but no longer operational. The soldiers who used them are nearly all gone as well, the last of the World War II generation passing from memory into history. But the impact of what they did, the precedent they set, the proof of concept they provided, that endures. Every night vision device used by every soldier anywhere in the world is, in some sense, a descendant of the T3 carbine. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the fundamental idea remains the same. Give soldiers the ability to see in darkness, and you change the nature of combat. Make the night visible, and you take away one of the oldest advantages in warfare. That is the legacy of the T3 carbine and the men who carried it on Okinawa in 1945. Not fame or glory or monuments, but a quiet, persistent influence on how wars are fought. The soldiers who used the infrared scopes did not seek recognition, and most would be surprised to learn that historians now regard their work as significant. They were just doing their jobs, trying to survive, making do with the equipment they were given. But in doing so, they participated in a revolution. They were the first to see the night as a place where soldiers could operate rather than as a barrier to operations. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.